Mark and Linda Smith seemed like the perfect small-town family, respected, close-knit, and ordinary. But when Linda walked in on her husband, a trusted police officer, committing an unthinkable act with their 12-year-old daughter, everything shattered. What followed was a desperate act of justice that ignited a dark investigation, peeling back layers of secrets no one could have imagined. In the heart of a quiet town nestled between rolling hills and whispering trees, life moved at a gentle pace. Here, neighbors waved from their porches, and the daily rhythm was punctuated by familiar routines, children playing in the streets, shopkeepers greeting customers by name, and police officers patrolling with a friendly nod. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else, and trust was the invisible thread weaving the community together. It was the kind of place where secrets rarely hid behind closed doors, or so people believed. Among the families that called this town home, the Smiths were seen as a shining example of stability and love. Mark Smith was a police officer who had spent more than a decade serving the town with dedication. He was known for his sharp mind, steady hand, and the calm way he diffused situations that could have turned violent. His uniform symbolized safety, and his presence was a reassurance to many. Mark had earned respect not just through his work, but through his involvement in local events, coaching youth sports, and his easy smile at community gatherings. His wife Linda was the heart of their home. She was a warm, kind woman whose gentle nature made her well-liked by friends and neighbors. Linda's days revolved around caring for their 12-year-old daughter, Emily, whom she adored. Emily was a bright child, lively and curious, with dreams that stretched far beyond the town's border. She loved school, had a close group of friends, and was often seen riding her bike along the quiet streets, or helping her mother tend the garden. The family appeared perfect, a picture of happiness and normalcy that the townsfolk admired and envied. Their home was modest but welcoming, with flowers blooming in the front yard, and wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze. The Smiths were known for their hospitality, often inviting neighbors over for barbecues or holiday celebrations. On the surface there was no hint of trouble, no sign of the storm that was about to shatter this peaceful existence. But beneath the calm, cracks were beginning to form, small, almost invisible fissures that would soon widen into a devastating break. Some neighbors whispered of late-night arguments heard through thin walls, though no one dared to intervene or ask questions. Others noticed Mark's increasingly withdrawn demeanor, how he sometimes seemed lost in thought, or how his smiles grew less frequent. Linda carried a quiet sadness that no one quite understood, masking pain behind her composed exterior. It was a town built on trust and routine, where everyone assumed the best of each other. The police were seen as protectors, families as safe havens. The idea that something horrific could be unfolding behind closed doors was unthinkable. Yet the perfect image of the Smith family was about to be torn apart in the most unimaginable way, and the shock would ripple through the entire community. This was a place where the worst secrets were believed to be far away, part of other towns or distant cities. But sometimes, darkness hides where it is least expected, and for the Smiths, that darkness was creeping closer every day, ready to explode and change everything forever. The quiet town would soon be rocked by a betrayal so deep it would leave scars no one could erase. Linda had no intention of coming home early that evening. The day had been long and filled with small frustrations, a broken washing machine, a missed call from work, and the lingering tension that had been growing between her and Mark for weeks. But a sudden wave of exhaustion washed over her, and she decided to leave the store where she had stopped for groceries and head home sooner than planned. She needed rest, a moment of quiet in a house that had lately felt colder than it should. The neighborhood was calm, shadows stretching long across the pavement as the sun dipped below the horizon. Linda unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting the familiar sounds of her daughter's laughter or the soft hum of the television. Instead, an eerie silence greeted her. It was the kind of silence that immediately raised a sense of unease. She called out Emily's name, but there was no answer. Then she noticed a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, their bedroom. Curiosity and a growing pit of dread propelled her forward. The closer she got, the heavier her heart became, and the world seemed to slow around her. What she saw when she peeked inside was a sight so unimaginable, it froze her in place. Mark, the man she had trusted with her life and the life of their child, was engaged in an act so horrific that it shattered the foundations of everything she believed. The innocence of her daughter was being stolen in a moment that could never be erased from her memory. Her mind screamed, but her body moved before she could think. The gun was on the kitchen counter, a relic from a time when Mark had once taught her about safety and protection. In that instant, the lines between right and wrong, between justice and vengeance, blurred into a desperate need to protect what remained. The gunshot rang out, loud and final, cutting through the stillness of the night like a thunderclap. Chaos erupted instantly. Mark crumpled to the floor, clutching his side, the shock evident in his eyes. Emily stood frozen, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Linda's hands trembled violently, her breath ragged as the realization of what she had done began to sink in. There was no turning back now. The quiet life she had known was gone, replaced by a nightmare that would haunt every moment from this point forward. The neighbors heard the shot and called 911 immediately. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the house within minutes, breaking the darkness with their urgent glow. Officers swarmed the scene, some of them colleagues of Mark's, their faces etched with disbelief. What started as a routine evening in a quiet town had suddenly exploded into a crisis that no one was prepared for. Linda was taken into custody but showed no resistance. The look in her eyes was one of broken trust and unbearable pain. Emily was rushed to the hospital, her small frame trembling as doctors examined her for signs of trauma. The community was left grappling with shock, unable to reconcile the horrifying truth with the family they thought they knew. The night that began like any other ended with lives shattered and questions that demanded answers. How could a man sworn to protect be the source of such evil? And how far would a mother go to shield her child from a darkness no one could have imagined? The answers lay tangled in the wreckage of that night, waiting to be uncovered as the investigation unfolded. But for Linda, there was only the heavy weight of a choice made in desperation, one that would forever change the fate of a small town and the family at its heart. The aftermath of that night unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare for everyone involved. The police officers who arrived on the scene were some of Mark's closest colleagues, men and women who had shared long shifts, tough calls, and quiet moments of camaraderie. Yet now they found themselves staring at a broken man bleeding on the floor and a mother sitting stunned in the living room, trembling and unable to explain what had just happened. The sight was unlike anything they had ever encountered in their small town. Mark was rushed to the hospital, his wound serious but not immediately life-threatening. Paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him, while Emily was taken by ambulance to a nearby children's hospital. The medical team treated her with gentle care, recognizing the delicate balance between physical and emotional trauma she was enduring. For the first time, the community heard whispers that the tragedy was far worse than anyone dared imagine. Linda was placed in police custody under heavy guard. She was cooperative but silent, her mind a whirlwind of shock, fear, and sorrow. Authorities began the painstaking process of gathering facts, starting with the little that could be gleaned from Linda's fractured statements and the overwhelming evidence at the scene. The investigation was complicated by the family's stature in the town and Mark's role as an officer of the law, raising difficult questions about impartiality and justice. News of the incident spread quickly, rippling through the close-knit community like a tidal wave. Residents who once admired the Smiths found themselves reeling, struggling to reconcile the horror with the family they thought they knew. Schools, churches, and local businesses became centers of whispered conversations, where people debated what had happened, pieced together rumors, and tried to understand how such a betrayal could exist in their midst. The local police department faced intense scrutiny. Mark's colleagues were divided. Some stood by him, unable to believe the accusations, while others questioned whether there had been warning signs they had ignored. Internal Affairs launched a separate inquiry, determined to uncover whether Mark had misused his authority or concealed a darker side behind his badge. For the first time, the line between protector and predator blurred painfully. Emily's condition was delicate. Doctors and counselors worked to provide her with a safe space where she could begin to heal, but the road ahead was uncertain. The child who had once been so full of life was now a symbol of trauma, and her future would depend on the courage of those willing to fight for her. Social workers stepped in, evaluating the home environment and considering what would be best for her safety and well-being moving forward. Linda's actions were polarizing. Some saw her as a desperate mother, pushed beyond reason by a betrayal too cruel to bear. Others feared the consequences of taking justice into one's own hands, worried about the dangerous message it sent. The legal system grappled with how to proceed, whether to charge her with attempted murder or recognize the complexity of her situation. Behind the scenes, reporters arrived to cover the story, adding fuel to the fire of speculation. Media outlets from neighboring towns and even larger cities descended, hungry for details, interviews, and the human drama that would captivate audiences. The Smith family's private tragedy became a public spectacle, with the town caught between protecting its own and exposing painful truths. As days turned into weeks, the shock began to settle, replaced by a chilling realization: nothing about this family was as simple or as perfect as it had seemed. The events of that night had cracked open a hidden world of secrets, lies, and unspoken horrors that would take months, if not years, to fully unravel. For the people of the town, the sense of safety was shattered, replaced by a growing unease that darkness could lurk behind even the most familiar faces. The investigation that followed was relentless and intense. Local law enforcement, with help from state agencies, began meticulously combing through every detail of the Smith family's life. Crime scene investigators returned to the house multiple times, searching for physical evidence that would confirm or challenge the horrifying allegation. Each room was photographed, analyzed, and catalogued. Forensic teams examined everything from fingerprints on the gun to traces of DNA in unexpected places. Nothing was overlooked. Officers interviewed neighbors, friends, and co-workers, piecing together a timeline of Mark's actions leading up to that night. Some neighbors admitted they had heard strange noises or seen unusual behavior, but had dismissed their concerns as minor domestic issues. Others revealed that Mark had been unusually withdrawn or tense lately, a far cry from the confident and dependable officer he had once been. Friends described a man increasingly distant from his family, while co-workers quietly speculated about stress or personal trouble. The most challenging part of the investigation was building a clear picture of what had happened between Mark and Emily. Child Protection Services stepped in, working alongside law enforcement to support Emily and gather information without further traumatizing her. Interviews with Emily were conducted with extreme care by specially trained professionals who understood the delicate nature of the situation. Every word, every hesitation was carefully recorded, analyzed for signs of truth or confusion. For the town, the investigation was a dark mirror reflecting the worst fears about someone they had trusted deeply. The police department struggled with how to manage the case internally while maintaining public trust. Mark had been a respected officer, and many in the force were torn between loyalty to a colleague and the undeniable evidence against him. This tension created an uncomfortable atmosphere within the department, with some officers avoiding the topic altogether, while others quietly pushed for transparency and justice. In court, the situation was complicated. Linda was charged with attempted murder, but her defense team argued her actions were driven by a desperate need to protect her daughter. Prosecutors had to grapple with how to present the evidence sensitively while pursuing charges. The case became a legal battleground, with both sides calling experts to testify about the trauma, the psychology of abuse, and the limits of a mother's rights when faced with unimaginable betrayal. As the investigation progressed, new and disturbing facts emerged. Old reports from Mark's past surfaced, revealing allegations that had been quietly dismissed years ago. These reports hinted at a pattern of inappropriate behavior and abuse of power, which had somehow been swept under the rug. The discovery raised serious questions about accountability and whether the system had failed to protect vulnerable victims before. Public pressure mounted for answers and justice. Town meetings grew tense as residents demanded transparency from local officials. Some community members formed support groups for victims of abuse, determined to bring attention to issues that had long been hidden behind closed doors. Others felt anger and confusion, struggling to reconcile their admiration for Mark with the chilling reality of the accusation. Meanwhile, Emily's healing remained the highest priority. Medical professionals worked tirelessly to support her recovery, both physically and emotionally. Counseling sessions were frequent, and efforts were made to provide her with a safe and nurturing environment away from the turmoil. Her well-being became a symbol of hope amid the chaos, a reminder that even in darkness there could be light. The investigation revealed much more than a single crime. It exposed a web of secrets and lies that had been carefully concealed. The town, once so sure of itself, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths, and as the pieces slowly came together, it became clear that this case was far from over. The search for justice was only beginning, and the fallout would change lives in ways no one could have predicted. As the investigation peeled back layers of the Smith family's life, more and more neighbors and friends began to share stories they had kept to themselves. What once seemed like a picture-perfect household was now revealed to be far more complicated, filled with tension and hidden struggle. People spoke of moments they had noticed but never understood, signs of strain that had been dismissed or overlooked in the quiet town. Late at night, some neighbors recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Smith house. The arguments were rare, but when they happened, they were intense and filled with anger. Others remembered seeing Mark leave abruptly on certain evenings, returning only in the early hours, always with a troubled expression. These small details painted a picture of a family wrestling with problems hidden beneath a calm surface. Mark's behavior, once admired, was now seen in a new light. Friends described how he had grown more controlling and secretive over time. He was often described as a man under pressure, but few suspected the pressure was a mask for something far darker. Linda, too, was no longer seen simply as the warm, gentle woman from community events. Some people whispered about her growing isolation, how she seemed tired and withdrawn, carrying burdens alone. The town's faith in the police department was shaken. Mark's fellow officers faced difficult questions about whether they had ignored warning signs or failed to act on concerns raised in private conversations. Rumors circulated that complaints against Mark had been quietly dismissed or never formally investigated. The community began to question the integrity of those sworn to protect them. The revelation of these hidden struggles raised uncomfortable questions about trust, loyalty, and denial. How had so many people missed the warning signs? Why had no one spoken up sooner? The town was forced to confront the painful reality that appearances could be deceiving, and that darkness often hides in plain sight. Meanwhile, Linda's story gained sympathy as more details emerged. It became clear that she had tried to protect her daughter for a long time, enduring years of fear and secrecy. Friends and family described her as a woman trapped by circumstance, struggling to hold together a family unraveling at the seams. Her decision to take drastic action was seen by many as a desperate act born from love and fear. Emily's experiences became a central focus of the town's attention. Those close to her spoke of a once joyful child who had been silenced by trauma. Schools arranged for counselors and special support programs to help her cope with the emotional aftermath. Teachers and classmates rallied around her, determined to provide a safe space where she could begin to heal. The cracks in the Smith family's story also revealed broader problems within the community. Abuse and neglect, long whispered about but rarely discussed openly, became topics of urgent concern. Local organizations began raising awareness and advocating for better support systems for victims. The tragedy sparked conversations about the need for vigilance, compassion, and accountability. Despite the growing awareness, some residents resisted facing the harsh truth. They clung to memories of the Smiths as a model family, unwilling to accept that such darkness could exist in their peaceful town. This denial created divisions, making healing and understanding even more difficult. The investigation had opened a Pandora's box, revealing a tangled web of pain and deception. The family's private turmoil was no longer hidden, it had become a public reckoning. As the town struggled to come to terms with what had happened, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The fragile trust that had held the community together was broken, replaced by a cautious awareness that sometimes, the greatest betrayals come from within. Emily's silence was one of the most heartbreaking parts of the unfolding tragedy. After the harrowing night, she withdrew into herself, barely speaking or responding to the people around her. The once lively and curious girl had become quiet and distant, her eyes reflecting a pain no child should ever bear. Medical staff and child psychologists knew that her silence was a protective shield, a way for her to cope with the overwhelming trauma she had experienced. Specially trained therapists worked patiently to create a safe and trusting environment for Emily. They understood that forcing her to speak could do more harm than good, so they used gentle techniques to help her feel secure. Art therapy, play therapy, and other child-friendly approaches were introduced, allowing Emily to express her feelings in ways words could not capture. Slowly, small breakthroughs began, brief moments of eye contact, hesitant smiles, or the occasional whisper that hinted at what lay beneath her silence. Throughout this time, social workers closely monitored Emily's well-being, coordinating with medical professionals and law enforcement to ensure her safety. They worked tirelessly to protect her from further trauma, both physical and emotional. Her living arrangements were carefully considered, with efforts made to provide a stable and nurturing environment away from the turmoil surrounding her family. Foster care was discussed, but the priority was always to keep Emily as close to a sense of normalcy as possible. The community's response was a mix of compassion and sorrow. Many residents offered support, donating clothes, toys, and books, hoping to bring some comfort to a child caught in the middle of a nightmare. Local schools arranged for counselors to work with Emily and her classmates, fostering understanding and kindness in a place that now felt unsafe to so many. Emily's teachers spoke of a quiet determination beneath her fragile exterior. Despite everything, she tried to keep up with her schoolwork and participate when she could. Her friends too showed remarkable empathy, often sitting with her at lunch or offering small acts of kindness that meant the world to a child struggling to find her way back to happiness. At the same time, the investigation continued to weigh heavily on Emily. Each new interview or medical examination was a difficult hurdle, forcing her to revisit the trauma she so desperately wanted to forget. Professionals involved in her care were careful to minimize the number of times she was questioned, recognizing the delicate balance between gathering necessary information and protecting her fragile state. The legal system faced a daunting challenge in handling Emily's case with sensitivity and care. Prosecutors and defense attorneys had to navigate the complexities of trauma-informed law, ensuring that Emily's rights and dignity were upheld throughout. Court proceedings were often closed to the public, with special accommodations made to shield her from the intense scrutiny that surrounded the case. Emily's journey toward healing was a long and uncertain one. The trauma she had endured would leave lasting scars, but the hope remained that with love, support and time, she could begin to reclaim her childhood. The people around her, family members, caregivers, therapists and friends, became her lifeline, working tirelessly to rebuild trust and safety. In the quiet moments, away from the chaos, Emily's story was a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest circumstances, the possibility of healing and hope remained. Her silence, once a sign of pain, slowly began to transform into a voice, one that would eventually tell a story no one could ignore, a story that demanded justice and change for her and others like her. As the court case unfolded, the town found itself gripped by a mix of anticipation, fear and outrage. The trial became the focal point of a community struggling to make sense of the unimaginable. Every detail brought to light was dissected, every piece of evidence examined with a harsh new clarity. The courtroom was filled with people eager for answers, yet fearful of what those answers might reveal. Linda's defense team built their case around the concept of a mother pushed to the edge. They portrayed Linda not as a criminal, but as a woman driven by a desperate need to protect her daughter from an evil she could no longer tolerate. Expert witnesses spoke about the psychological toll of abuse and trauma, explaining how a parent's protective instincts could lead to extreme, sometimes violent actions. These testimonies struck a chord with many, offering a glimpse into the emotional chaos that had overwhelmed Linda. The prosecution, on the other hand, focused on the law and the need for accountability. They argued that taking justice into one's own hands could never be justified, no matter the circumstance. Their case emphasized the importance of due process and the dangers of vigilante actions, warning that allowing such behavior could lead to chaos and undermine the rule of law. The prosecution also highlighted the risks posed to Mark's life, emphasizing that shooting someone, even a spouse, was a serious offense with consequences. Throughout the trial, Emily's testimony was handled with extreme care. She was never forced to relive the most painful moments in public, and her statements were given through specially trained intermediaries who ensured she was protected from trauma as much as possible. The court acknowledged the delicate nature of her situation, allowing for accommodations that respected her age and emotional state. Her words, when finally heard, were powerful and heartbreaking, giving voice to a pain many had only glimpsed in silence. Media coverage was relentless. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, broadcasting updates and stirring public opinion. The story attracted attention far beyond the town's borders, drawing in viewers and readers from across the region.
Some media outlets sensationalized the case, focusing on lurid details and creating narratives that often distorted the reality. This added pressure made the legal process even more challenging, forcing judges and attorneys to carefully manage what information was released and when. Within the town, opinions were deeply divided. Some residents saw Linda as a heroine who had saved her daughter from unimaginable harm. Others viewed her as a criminal who had crossed a line that should never be crossed. Families debated the case over dinner tables. Schools held special assemblies to discuss the importance of justice and support for victims, and local leaders struggled to maintain community cohesion. Behind the scenes, the emotional toll on everyone involved was immense. Lawyers, social workers, therapists, and law enforcement officers carried the heavy burden of navigating a case filled with trauma and complexity. The Smith family's tragedy had become a catalyst for conversations about abuse, power, and the limits of justice in desperate situations. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, a chilling twist emerged. New evidence came to light, previously hidden messages and documents that suggested the family's problems were even deeper and more twisted than anyone had suspected. These revelations complicated the case further, raising questions about who had known what and when, and whether there had been more victims hidden in the shadows. The courtroom drama was far from over, and the final verdict would not only determine Linda's fate but also send ripples through the community, challenging long-held beliefs about trust, protection, and the price of justice. In the end, the trial was more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning with the darkest parts of human nature and the desperate lengths one mother would go to fight for her child.
The new evidence that surfaced during the trial sent shockwaves through the entire community and cast the Smith family's story in a much darker, more complex light. It was discovered that Mark had been involved in a series of disturbing activities that had remained hidden for years. These revelations painted a picture of a man who had carefully constructed a facade of respectability, while concealing a pattern of manipulation, abuse, and corruption. Investigators uncovered encrypted messages on Mark's personal devices, texts and emails that suggested he had been involved in illegal activities, far beyond the accusations at the center of the trial. There were hints of financial fraud, tampering with evidence in other police cases, and secret dealings with unsavory figures. More alarming were references to controlling behavior over Linda and Emily, suggesting a long history of intimidation and emotional abuse that had gone unreported. This evidence forced the court and the public to rethink everything they thought they knew about the case. What had seemed like an isolated act of desperation by Linda now appeared to be a response to years of hidden torment. The defense seized on these revelations, arguing that Linda's actions were the result of living under constant threat and abuse, making her decision to act not only understandable, but inevitable. At the same time, this new information deepened the investigation into the police department itself. How had Mark managed to keep these secrets for so long without being caught? Were there others within the department who knew about his behavior and chose to ignore it? The scandal grew, shaking the foundation of the local law enforcement community and forcing a widespread internal review. The media frenzy intensified. Headlines focused on Mark's double life, the corruption allegations, and the systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked. Public trust in the police department plummeted, and demands for reform echoed through the town. Community leaders promised transparency and accountability, but the damage to the department's reputation was profound and long-lasting. Amid these revelations, Linda's situation grew even more complicated. The prosecution struggled to counter the mounting evidence of Mark's wrongdoing. Their case against Linda was weakened, as the focus shifted from her actions to the environment of abuse and fear she had endured. The judge allowed expert testimony on domestic abuse and coercive control, giving the jury a broader understanding of the circumstances that led to that fateful night. For Emily, these revelations were both painful and validating. Though she was too young to fully comprehend all the legal details, she understood that the truth about her father was finally coming to light. The knowledge that the man who had hurt her was being held accountable brought a measure of relief, even as the emotional scars remained. The town grappled with the fallout from these revelations. Support groups for abuse victims grew, and local organizations worked harder than ever to educate the public about recognizing and reporting abuse. Conversations about mental health, trauma, and the need for vigilance became more common, breaking down some of the silence and stigma that had allowed abuse to thrive. Yet even with these positive steps, healing was slow and difficult. The Smith family's story had fractured the community's sense of safety, and trust would take years to rebuild. People who had once felt secure in their small town now looked at their neighbors with suspicion and The case became a powerful, tragic example of how appearances can deceive and how deep the wounds of abuse can run. It revealed not only the horrors within one family but also the failures of institutions meant to protect the vulnerable. As the trial continued, it was clear that the search for justice was far from over. What lay ahead was a reckoning not just for Linda and Mark, but for the entire town and its values. As the trial edged closer to its conclusion, the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The community watched closely, desperate for closure but uncertain about what the final verdict would bring. The case had evolved far beyond a simple story of crime and punishment. It was now a profound examination of justice, morality and the limits of the law. The defense team's strategy had shifted from merely explaining Linda's actions to exposing the systemic failures that had allowed abuse and corruption to flourish unchecked. They presented testimonies from former colleagues of Mark, who described a pattern of intimidation and silence within the police department. These witnesses spoke of a culture where complaints were ignored, victims were silenced, and loyalty to the badge took precedence over truth and justice. At the heart of the defense was the argument that Linda's desperate act was a final tragic response to years of suffering, both hers and Emily's. Psychologists testified about the psychological effects of prolonged abuse, explaining how victims might reach a breaking point where self-preservation and protection of loved ones become the only driving force. This testimony aimed to humanize Linda and shift the jury's focus from the act itself to the circumstances that provoked it. The prosecution, however, remained firm in its stand. They emphasized the importance of law and order, warning against setting a precedent where individuals took justice into their own hands. They argued that the proper way to address abuse was through the legal system, not vigilante actions, no matter how understandable the motivation. The prosecution also pointed to the physical harm Linda caused to Mark, underscoring that violence was never an acceptable solution. Public opinion remained divided. Some community members saw Linda as a hero who had saved her daughter from unspeakable harm, while others believed that justice required her to face the consequences of her violent action. This divide fueled heated discussions in homes, churches, and community gatherings, reflecting the deep emotional wounds left by the case. In the midst of the trial, Emily continued her slow journey toward healing. Although protected from direct exposure to the courtroom, the weight of the proceedings was felt in her everyday life. Her caregivers worked tirelessly to shield her from the media frenzy while providing consistent support through therapy and education. Emily's resilience became a symbol of hope, reminding the community that recovery, though difficult, was possible. Then came the final unexpected twist. During closing arguments, Linda's defense revealed a previously undisclosed letter from Mark, written shortly before the tragic night. In it, Mark admitted to a long history of abusive behavior and expressed fear of losing control if his secrets were exposed. The letter painted a chilling portrait of a man aware of his destructive actions, but unwilling or unable to stop them. This letter shocked everyone in the courtroom and the wider community. It confirmed the defense's claims and offered a haunting glimpse into the dark reality behind the family's facade. For many, it was the moment when the story truly shifted, from one of criminal acts to a tragic saga of abuse, power, and survival. As the jury deliberated, the town waited with bated breath. The case had tested their beliefs and shaken their sense of security, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about people they thought they knew and the systems designed to protect them. The verdict would not only determine Linda's fate, but also send a message about how justice is understood in the face of profound human suffering. Regardless of the outcome, the Smith family's story had already left an indelible mark, a reminder that beneath even the most ordinary lives, darkness can lurk, and that the quest for justice is often complicated by the tangled realities of pain, fear, and loss. The jury's verdict marked the end of a long and painful chapter for the Smith family and the entire community. After hours of deliberation, they returned with a decision that would resonate far beyond the courtroom wall. Linda was found guilty of a lesser charge, manslaughter instead of attempted murder, acknowledging the complex circumstances behind her action. The verdict reflected a recognition of the abuse and trauma she and Emily endured, while still affirming that taking a life even in desperation carried serious consequences. Sentencing was a somber affair. The judge emphasized the tragic nature of the case, expressing sorrow for the victims and the family torn apart by violence and betrayal. Linda received a prison sentence, but it was tempered by the court's understanding of the exceptional circumstance. The sentence allowed for the possibility of parole with a focus on rehabilitation and mental health support. Mark's fate was sealed separately. He faced charges related to abuse, corruption and misconduct, leading to a conviction that removed him permanently from his position of authority. The police department underwent sweeping reforms in the wake of the scandal, with new leadership committed to transparency, accountability and rebuilding public trust. Several officers resigned or were dismissed, and a series of policies were introduced to prevent future abuses of power. Emily's life slowly began to regain a fragile sense of normalcy. She was placed with relatives who provided a stable and loving environment, far removed from the trauma of her early years. Therapy continued to be a crucial part of her recovery, helping her process her experiences and develop resilience. While the scars remained, those around her believed that with time and care, healing was possible. The community faced the difficult task of healing as well. The shock of the Smith family's story had exposed deep wounds and forced many to confront uncomfortable realities about abuse, secrecy, and institutional failure. Local leaders, activists, and residents came together to promote awareness and support for victims of abuse, working to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence. Schools implemented programs to educate children about personal safety and encourage open communication with trusted adults. Law enforcement agencies introduced new training focused on recognizing and addressing signs of abuse within families and their own ranks. The town's collective resolve to change became a beacon of hope amid the darkness. Still, the story left a lingering sense of unease. The betrayal by someone sworn to protect had shattered trust in ways that would take years to rebuild. Some community members remained skeptical, haunted by memories of what had happened and wary of those in power. The scars ran deep, a reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces. The Smith family's tragedy became a cautionary tale shared far beyond the small town. It was a story told in law enforcement seminars, counseling workshops and community forums, a stark example of how complex and heartbreaking abuse cases can be. It underscored the need for vigilance, compassion and systems that truly protect the vulnerable. For Linda, the path forward was uncertain but hopeful. Though incarcerated, she found moments of peace in therapy and the chance to confront her past. Her fight for redemption was ongoing, driven by a fierce love for Emily and a desire to make sense of a life shattered by betrayal. Emily too carried the story with her, painful but also a source of strength. As she grew, she became a quiet advocate for survivors, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure and eventually triumph. The small town would never forget what had happened, but it chose to face the future with determination to learn, heal and protect. The story of the Smith family was a painful chapter in its history, but also a catalyst for change, a testament to the power of truth and the courage it takes to seek justice in the face of unimaginable darkness.